Well, I promise you those of you who stuck around this far through the day, some pretty wildlife pictures, okay? I grew up in southeastern Iowa along the Mississippi River. The most important part of my education were the many days and weekends that my brothers and I spent exploring the hills, the valleys, and the rivers of that area. Many weekends found us in our wooden canvas canoe on the rivers of the area, the Skunk, the Cedar, the Iowa, the Des Moines, and of course the Mississippi. We knew the locations of where the heron reefs were, where the red-tailed hawk nested, where pileated woodpeckers had their holes, and the best places to hide and watch bald eagles fish in the wintertime. After a career which has taken me around the world, working with wildlife, with people, and the land organism, I'm now asked for my vision of what Iowa should provide for its young explorers of today and tomorrow. I thank Neil and the Ag Law Center for the opportunity. Fortunately, I'm not the only one who's had to think about this. A wildlife action plan for Iowa, abbreviated IWAP, so if you hear me say IWAP, that's what I'm talking about, was initially approved in 2006 after several years of work by a cross-section of wildlife and fisheries professionals, conservation NGOs, educational institutions, agricultural groups, private wildlife-oriented enterprises. The plan and the 2015 version that looks back on what the first 10 years accomplished is available on the Iowa DNR website. Let's see if this, there we go. I urge you to read it and absorb it. It goes into a great deal more detail than I can present in my allotted time. The first time anything like this, however, was attempted was by Aldo Leopold in the 1930s. He was asked by one of the founding members of the Iowa Conservation Commission, a man by the name of Ding Darling, you've heard several times today, to conduct a game survey of Iowa. It was much less comprehensive than the current DNR plan was, the IWAP, and it came at a time when Iowa's wildlife species were largely decimated by the lack of laws, the lack of any moral concern for species other than ourselves, and a lack of knowledge as to what their needs were. They were basically extirpated from the landscape, a landscape that was known as a country so full of game. Let's see if we can make this work. I refer you to Jim Dinsmore's book by that title for a full accounting of our dismal wildlife history. By way of a quick summary, I'll say that by the turn of the last century, our forefathers and foremothers had basically eliminated many wildlife species from Iowa. Bison, elk, yes, we had lots of elk here. White-tailed deer, gone by the end of the last century, or by the turning of the last century. Canada geese, wild turkeys, beaver, bobcats, black bears, mountain lions, trumpeter swans, herons, and sandhill and whooping cranes were all gone from the Iowa landscape. Until the implementation of the Wildlife Action Plan, Iowa had long lacked any kind of systematic way of documenting the distribution and abundance of most wildlife species. We now have that, although it is horribly underfunded. Since my childhood, many species have been restored through the efforts and the expertise of the DNR, of the Iowa DNR. White-tailed deer, river otters, wild turkeys, trumpeter swans, Canada geese, peregrine falcons, ospreys, all of them now grace our landscape and our waters. And others have come back due to the efforts of at the regional and national levels, including things like bald eagles and bobcats, wood ducks, and sandhill cranes, and many others. At their core, the restored and recovered species have returned and thrived due to a combination of habitat available on both public and private land, funding from public and private sources, scientifically sound management, and passage and enforcement of a variety of laws and rules regarding their take or harvest. But as the 2006 IWAP states, after more than 8 decades of conservation, 1/3 of all of Iowa's fish and wildlife are still considered in need of immediate conservation to stop their numbers from eventually dwindling. Why is that? How can that be? What are the major obstacles? I think it's because of 3 things. One, a relative lack of open space and public land providing habitat and the fragmentation of those habitats. Secondly, the dominance of a monocultural crops on our landscape. And third, the decrease in funding, which it's been happening every year now for the last decade, particularly at the state and federal levels for wildlife, including fish, for their management, for the research on them, and for open spaces. Iowa ranks near the bottom in public land ownership in states. Less than 3% of our land, of our 36 million acres, is in public ownership by federal, state, or county entities. Less than 3%. We are next to last in the states. If you look at them, you can barely see some of them on the map here behind us. And you can see that even those that exist are very isolated and further fragmented by roads and other features. Iowa's historically diverse complex of roads that crisscross the landscape every mile or so have been critical in the development of our farm-to-market agricultural economy. But so too have they been important in contributing to wildlife decline, often providing barriers to species and fragmenting and isolating the habitat patches that are still left. As vehicle speeds have increased, they have also become factors in direct mortality of many species, both large and small. It can be argued, in fact, that the accessibility of nearly every square inch of Iowa land by road, certainly every square mile, to humans prevents many species that were once here from reestablishing themselves to the few habitat patches that are left. The list includes, among others, black bears. Some of you may cheer that they're not here. Elk, hitting an elk would not be great either. And wolves, again. These are all a factor that the roads prevent. Lots of other smaller species as well. While complexes of habitat, usually a patchwork of federal, state, and county-owned lands, as well as private lands, while those have been important, they're often frequently interrupted by row crop agriculture, public roads. In fact, the only reasonably continuous corridors of habitat we have left in Iowa are our rivers. Let me repeat that. Rivers are the only reasonably continuous corridors of habitat that we have left in the state. We've converted to other uses about 99.9% of our prairies, 95 to 99% of the wetlands, and over 70% of the woodlands that were here when Euro-American ancestors began to settle Iowa in the 1830s. The vast majority of Iowa is now a landscape dominated by human-centric activities, whatever they might be. Wildlife are an afterthought. Had some visionaries, people like Teddy Roosevelt, Ding Darling, Gifford Pinchot, Ada Hayden, John Lacey, you've seen some of these names up here earlier, Aldo Leopold, and others of their contemporaries. Had they not taken action at the beginning of the last century, in the first half of the 20th century, it's highly doubtful that we would have very much of the habitat or of the diversity of wildlife that we have here in Iowa today. We owe them a large debt of thanks. We also owe them, I think, though, and our children and grandchildren much more, the need to envision the future and to make it happen. That, of course, is what this conference is all about. I believe that lacking habitat along our river corridors, whether it was maintained because it was too subject to flooding, too steep to plow, or was more intentionally preserved, many of the recovered species we have, and I gave that list earlier, the wild turkeys, the deer, etc., otters, that many of those species would not be at the place they are today. It's because the river corridors were there that they were able to spread across our landscape. The future of wildlife in Iowa, then, I think is very much tied, closely linked to the future of our rivers and streams. If we fail to protect and improve the habitats along our rivers and streams, wildlife will further decline, both in terms of numbers of species and in terms of numbers of individuals of many species. Those which are able to adapt to human-dominated landscape will continue are unable to adapt to that human-dominated landscape will continue to decline. These are so-called specialist species, those with specialized nesting, feeding, or space needs. They're going to suffer the most and disappear from the Iowa landscape. Those species that have found ways to adapt their needs to be flexible to such a landscape will continue to exist and perhaps even thrive. Those species are called generalists, and they're the ones that are most flexible in fulfilling their basic needs for food, water, shelter, and space. They coexist with humans. Some even become pests in our eyes. All you have to do is think about deer and raccoons in many urban areas, Canada geese on golf courses, airports, and in front of corporate headquarters, or starlings and house sparrows on livestock feedlots, to know what I mean by pests. Those of you who are golfers are sorry, I'm sure, that we've restored Canada geese onto our golf courses. We didn't do that intentionally. The golf courses just provided the habitat for them. Currently, only about 2.7% of Iowa's habitat are permanently protected in some way. About 895,000 acres by state, county, or federal land ownership, and another 107,000 acres, that's significant, on private lands in permanent easements. If we're to even double that over the next 10 years, as the IWAP envisions, we must engage a very large cadre of private landowners to enroll land in permanent easements. The IWAP has 6 visions. You can see them here. Number 1 is that we're going to have viable wildlife populations that are compatible with modern landscapes and with human social tolerance. Number 2, we're going to have healthy ecosystems and incorporate diverse native habitats capable of sustaining viable wildlife populations. Number 3, diverse wildlife communities will be developed on public and private lands and waters. Moreover, number 4, Iowans are going to participate in wildlife-associated recreation, and the plan talks about the kinds of values that those bring in. You've heard many of that today. Certainly, the millions and millions of dollars that are spent on various forms of wildlife recreation actually convert many times over in our economy. So more Iowans participating. Number 5, Iowans will respect wildlife for its many values and advocate for it. And number 6, stable permanent funding will be found. Interesting. The IWAP places an emphasis on habitat, in particular for species, what are called species of greatest conservation concern, or greatest conservation need. They reason then that the generalist species are going to thrive if habitats available for threatened species is restored and protected. And here's the map, what's called the map of opportunity. Note that very much of it is along our river corridors. In the northwest, You have the Little Sioux and the Big Sioux rivers, certainly the Missouri along the western border, through the central part of the state, particularly the Des Moines River corridor and the west fork of the Des Moines, the Skunk, the Iowa, the Cedar, the Wapsie. All of those opportunity areas are along our rivers. This is why I very strongly believe, even more so, that that the future of wildlife is tied to what we do along our rivers. So what must we do? Well, I think we, first of all, must sort of define and protect and manage riparian zones, those areas along our streams and rivers, as buffers. In my 1,800 miles of paddling Iowa rivers over the past 4 summers, there are lots of landowners, many landowners, public and private landowners, that highly value these riparian zones and have done a pretty good job of protecting them. However, there are many that have not. You've seen some of the pictures up here today. Thus, we need to create a formula for the riparian area, for these buffers of wild habitat that includes such things as slope, bank composition, the soils, species composition, and the dominant use of the surrounding land, and probably other factors as well that to determine what's the minimum and the maximum width we need for these buffers. I don't believe it's a one-size-fits-all. The Minnesota law has declared 30 feet or 60 feet or whatever it is, 50 feet I think it is, as the magical number. I don't think a one-size-fits-all is a good way to do it, but I think we can develop this formula. It must also include fencing against livestock, only if they're present, of course, to prevent livestock from entering the river or stream. This is going to entail a change of laws in Iowa, some that are quite old, that have given ownership of the land beside and under the stream, the land beside and under the stream, largely to private owners. Though the public owns the water, as it were, this ownership arrangement applies to the vast majority of our streams and rivers, while a relatively few are somewhat more widely protected by being designated as meandered rivers. And meandered is not a geographical or geological term, but actually a legal one. What else must we do? Well, I think we have to better define what the public interest is in the water that flows into our rivers. If we define that, such from those both point and non-point sources, things like tile lines and drainage ditches, we can define that public interest and be able to better protect it. We've got to restore and make better use of things like constructed wetlands, oxbows, saturated buffers, and other sort of emerging technologies to better manage the nutrients and the other chemicals that reach our rivers and streams today from both rural and urban runoff. And lastly, I think we have to research and design ways to better capture and clean the stormwater runoff in our cities and towns, removing the macro and micro waste from it before it reaches our streams and rivers. This is one area, like agriculture, that was specifically removed from the Clean Water Act, as sort of exempted from the Clean Water Act. And if you paddle along any of our rivers today, you see massive 6-foot diameter or more stormwater runoff that enters directly. Anything that goes in the street ends up in our rivers because they're allowed to do that. No city or town wants to tackle that. It's a big problem. To make other larger habitat areas available, we've got to find the political will and the economic means to increase the amount of publicly owned wild areas in Iowa and the acres of land in private ownership with permanent easements. The IWAP goal is to reach a total of 4% of Iowa's land under permanent habitat protection by 2030. 4%. So it's basically doubling what we have now. I think we should work towards a larger percentage of the land in public ownership and permanent private easements, something approaching maybe 10% of our landscape. This is going to better reflect an increasingly urban population and their needs. Will still protect the most valuable and productive agricultural land, and it will respect the broader public need for a high quality of life and landscape in which to grow and recreate. It will, of course, also provide the needed critical habitat areas for a diversity of wildlife species. What are the areas that should be prioritized? I've listed them here. I think riparian buffer zones, as I've said. Secondly, areas that are adjacent to or close to existing public areas, and therefore increases the habitat patch size that are available for wildlife and for us. Areas with few or no roads or other human-constructed items that fragment the habitat. And lastly, land that has frequently been temporarily restored with public funds. Things like CRP and other temporary land retirement programs that have been in and out of the federal farm bills since the 1930s, and flood-prone areas received by FEMA funds. It seems to me that taxpayers are willing to help private landowners implement conservation on their lands, but to do it over and over and over as the programs change on the same acres doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think taxpayers may be revolting against that. I do not believe, nor is it my desire, that Iowa will ever return to its pre-Euro-American settlement landscape. As the IOAP states, when habitat goal is met, the vast majority of Iowa land, or land in Iowa, will still be in private ownership and used for agricultural purposes. Meeting the wildlife population goals is going to require intensive and carefully planned management on lands and waters protected for wildlife, whether it's in public or private ownership. Management is going to take a look across, need a broad consensus among both landowners and other conservationists. All of this takes money. We're going to have to pay, and a willingness to find those resources. Nearly all conservation in this state has been and will continue to be accomplished by a combination of public and private dollars. Sportsmen and women, especially hunters and anglers, have both through the excise taxes that they pay on firearms and ammunition, fishing and boating equipment, and marine fuel, licenses and habitat stamps they buy annually. They've all contributed for many, many years. It's going to take a lot more than that. The conservation organizations to which they belong and contribute, donate money and time to, things like lobbying work and physical work on the landscape and habitat and projects, restoring habitat. The NGOs that have done that are things like the Isaac Walton League, the Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, National Wild Turkey Federation. There's this proliferation of various interest groups. Whitetails Unlimited, Quail Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, and lots of others. Increasingly, it's included, especially in Iowa, it's been extremely important in our development, has included other land conservation trusts and NGOs, like the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation that you heard from Joe earlier today, the Nature Conservancy, and certainly county land trust groups. The Iowa DNR has tirelessly also sought funds for habitat protection through the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, state wildlife grants, the Environmental Protection Agency, Iowa County Conservation Boards. All of these various agencies have provided funds, and the DNR has gone after them. Other sources of funding also include some things have come from general fund appropriations, from city, county, state, or federal, like FEMA buyouts of flood-prone lands. Funding from a variety of state and federal laws, including gambling receipts, oil and gas revenues, grazing revenues on public lands, voluntary contributions through income tax checkoffs, all those sorts of things. In Iowa, 63% of voters, 63% of Iowa voters in 2010, which was otherwise a very, very conservative election year, passed a state constitutional amendment that created the Natural Resource and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund, the I Will campaign that went on. It was to be funded by a 3/8 cent sales tax increase. The legislature has never passed the sales tax, so it remains unfunded 8 years later. That fund would provide, as you just learned, at least $180 million per year for such priorities, and it would generate lots and lots of other match dollars as well. We must fund it now. That's all there is to it. I think Leopold stated it best. I'm glad I shall never be young without wild places to be young in. Of what avail are 40 freedoms without a blank spot on the map? The blank spots on the map are not only for us, they're for the other species with whom we share this earth, and hopefully they will prosper as we implement some of these plans. Thank you very much.